The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we look at one of the world's enduring conflicts, sibling rivalry. Then, J.N. Jagannathan speaks to author Daniel McFarlane about why Lake Ontario is the most misunderstood of the Great Lakes. That's ahead on The Agenda. Unless you're an only child, the longest-standing relationship many Canadians are going to have isn't with friends, partners, or parents, but rather siblings. Siblings are, usually, one of the lifelong companions you don't get to choose, and sometimes, often, conflict creeps in. Sibling rivalry is a tale as old as time, from biblical stories to more contemporary examples of sporting excellence. Why do sibling rivalries begin? And will they ever really abate? Let's ask Justin DeVries, a state lawyer and mediator at DeVries Litigation. Steve Jordaens, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto Scarborough. Allison Schaefer, parenting expert and family counselor. And Natasha Begagny, clinical therapist and founder of NKS Therapy. And it's great to have you four around this table for what's going to be a great discussion, I can tell. Allison, get us started. When does sibling rivalry emerge?
Well, I would say that if you are a only child and then the next sibling comes along, you're going to have to make a decision about how much threat that person is perceived to be for you.
So even if you're only 2 years old?
It's still subjective because suddenly the constellation of the family has changed and there's a new kid in town that is going to want to have some of parental attention, parental resources, their love. You're going to be held as a comparator too. But it is very subjective whether or not they really decide that that is highly threatening or whether they're like, I got another playmate, maybe we can work this out. So there's a real range. It is not predictive that you're going to have sibling rivalry. You're going to have some conflict occasionally, as in any intimate relationship, but you're not fated to be rivals in the definition of really feeling like this is the person who blocks my sunshine. This is the person, it's like Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes or something where you've really got somebody who just ruins your life by their very presence. That is not always the case.
Okay, but when it is, why does it start?
Well, I mean, we've heard one of the big things, which is parental attention. And we want, that's how we feel we're valued. That's how we feel we're loved, by how our parents attend to us and interact with us. And so when we have that all to ourselves for a while, that's fantastic. But as Adler kind of described it, when that second kid comes along, the first one is sort of dethroned. They lose their privileged status in the family. And, that takes a little bit of getting used to. And as was said, it depends how that plays out. It can play out in different ways, but that's certainly where it all stems from.
Natasha, we call it sibling rivalry, which automatically suggests it's a negative, bad thing. Is that in fact the case?
Not necessarily. I think rivalry would imply some kind of, as we're talking about, competition, right? For resources, for attention, for airtime. And I think that there is a healthy element to that dynamic, and it is a reflection to some degree of a reality that exists in the world. So I don't think it's all bad, but maybe the word is perhaps misleading in the sense that it can make it seem like it's a more negative concept than it really is. But I think it depends how those children or how the two siblings play that out, how that dynamic carries out, because rivalry can become something more troubling.
Yeah, so I was going to just share. So I have 3 older brothers, and I joke and say they made me the man I am today. Like, I took on a lot of masculine qualities. I have a very low register to my voice. I could speak up here if I wanted to, but I chose a lower tonality. And I was like the little engine that could. I had to keep up. I had to really give it my best shot to keep up with the guys. So they gave me my ambition and drive. So I don't.
So that's a positive thing.
That's absolutely a positive thing.
This is a situation where there are 4 siblings. Justin, what if there are 2, only 2? Is it particularly acute under those circumstances?
No, not at all. I think I don't know if there's a good predictor of what brings, a family into conflict within a state. It depends on the personalities. I mean, usually life has progressed a long way, so other elements come involved. It's often about money. But they do say, a will is a last letter to the living. And if you treat people differently in that causes problems, and it often resurrects a lot of the resentment or some of the disputes that went on when people were kids. Mom loved you more, I looked after mom, you went to Vancouver, dad gave you more money, you weren't around, you never visited, and it all comes out.
It all comes out then.
But families are able, the good news I think is families have enough residue goodwill that in the legal world, if we go to a mediation, they can patch over some of the differences and move forward.
Do we see more sibling rivalry, in the negative sense of the word, when the personalities among the kids are very similar or very different?
It's a good question. First, I also want to mention that I think the family constellation of 3 siblings can actually increase the chance of sibling rivalry. But I do think that there's an element of personality difference that is, and I've done some research in this area as well. So there is a nature element to it. There are some children who have certain personality traits that are maybe make them more extroverted. Maybe they're high on neuroticism. Maybe they're, and that can play a significant role in addition to how the parents are managing that dynamic, and if they're playing favorites, if one is, that's another major element, is how the parents are managing it. But yes, personality plays a role.
I got the parenting person right here. Let me go to you on this.
Well,
okay, so
I would agree that the closer in age, and if they have the same gender, then they are going to be more comparable. It's apples to apples instead of apples to bananas kind of a thing. And so that means if you're highly comparable, those little nuanced differences are going to stimulate more competition. So if you're further apart in age and you're of different genders, then you're more likely to say, well, of course, they're older than me. They're different from me. Yeah. So the competition comes down.
In my world, personalities are a big deal, though, because remember, life has gone on. People are fixed in who they are. And if you have the bully or you have someone who's more, willing to compromise, that comes out. So the age difference disappears a little bit because you then have personalities, and big personalities cause problems. You could have 2 people fighting, you could have 4 people fighting, you often get camps where people get involved, and then you throw in spouses into the mix too, and that too can cause further grief amongst the family.
I don't know why I'm smiling so much during this show, because this is serious, often negative, very debilitating stuff, and yet so much of this we find funny when it's other people, right?
Yeah, although I would like to point out that sibling rivalry is really an opportunity for parents. I mean, it is inevitable to some degree, not necessarily the rivalry as you described, but certainly the competition, and this is the first chance when children start to socially negotiate with their peers and try to reach compromises and listen to one another, etc. And if parents, I think, take charge, and that begins, of course, with the hardest step, which is modeling, this sort of thing yourself, that when you have a controversy with your spouse, to do that openly in front of your children, to listen to each other first and model good, effective listening, to maybe reach compromise states and let children realize, hey, they don't always get exactly what they want either. They sometimes had to compromise.
Steve, that never happens. Come on.
This is the opportunity that exists, that because we know, by the way, that social connection is the number one predictor of happiness in life. And if we can teach our children how to form relationships, maintain relationships, manage relationships, that's the most powerful gift we can give them. So it's certainly worth the time and effort.
What he's saying is very key about the conflict. I have to just piggyback on that, because if we don't frame conflict from an early age as an opportunity, as you said, for growth, then it can quickly become something that we are afraid of and avoid. And that I see that very commonly. I even grew up in a household like that. But conflict is really what moves people forward in their connection. But we can become, if we're afraid of it, if it feels negative, if we're feeling uncomfortable because we didn't learn how to do it, then we can carry that forward and we avoid it and it festers, and then you can actually build resentment. So it's either an opportunity for growth or it's an opportunity for its regression.
I think before we go any further, we need to understand here how much of what we're hearing is professional knowledge and how much of it you've lived. Okay, we know you're one of 4 siblings.
Yes, right. I had to lead with that.
Yeah.
I'm one of 3.
You're one of 3.
And I'm the youngest.
You're the youngest of three?
Yes.
Yeah, never any problems there, were there? Right, right. You?
I'm one of three, middle child.
So you're the classic negotiator, right? You're keeping the peace among the other two?
Yeah, a lot of fairness. Alison, you're right on that.
Issues about fairness.
Middle child.
Because you're the middle child.
Not always to a positive, yes. Like it can be a little bit obsessive at times.
Got it.
To the
Steve?
detriment. Yeah.
I'm the baby of four.
Baby
And
of
I have
four?
3 older sisters.
Oh, so you two have got a lot of
Yes.
simpatico.
Yeah. Well, really, all 3 of us. 3 babies on the agenda. I don't know why.
Because babies they don't have any strength except for their charm and personalities. So we had to win the fights with something. We had to be adorable.
And you still are, Alison.
Absolutely.
Yes, you still are.
Yes, we had to use our wit. Yes.
And what's
100%.
interesting too in the estate world, when parents go away, they're often the referee too, or people curb their behavior as adults. The parents go, and then you get more, the conflict comes out, throw some money in there, fighting about the spoons, who gets the Royal Dalton, who doesn't. And it can be it can be a toxic mix for sure. But as in the legal field, we're not therapists. So we have to kind of put the pieces together based on facts and try to get people to move forward.
But if I hear what you're all saying, birth order matters a lot in terms of sibling rivalry, in as much as, like, I bet you had a certain rivalry more with one of the 3 others as opposed to all of the 3 others. Is that fair to say?
Typically, when you kind of map out a family and where they fall in the family, the person who is next to you in line tends to be the one that's the highest competition, and that can often be the more fractured relationship. And you tend to skip the one next to you and play and hang out and have a more positive relationship with the next one in line, where the threat's a little bit less. It's not to say you don't have a built-in playmate, and again, you're not fated for this, but that's a very common pattern.
Middle child, birth order matters a lot in the dynamic in your home?
I think so, and I agree, or at least I've lived that experience where I'm the younger sister, so I have an older sister 4 years older and a younger brother about 1.5 years. And I do think that there was certainly some felt throne stealing, although I didn't mean to steal anyone's throne, but I think I lived a little bit of that, yeah.
Now, what if one of the 2 of them were in that chair instead of you? Would I be getting a different recitation of what happened?
Probably, and everyone has an individual experience, right? It's very subjective. It's very, one person's child's experience of the family dynamic is not the same as the other child's, and there's a lot of subjectivity in that as well.
So how about you being the baby of 4? How did that affect the dynamic among the 4 of you?
Pretty much nailed it. So my closest oldest sister, that was where the most friction was. If I ate all the chocolate chips and Mom said, "Who did it?" I pointed to her. she was the one. Whereas the oldest sister, she was almost, she was my closest connection for sure.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I just want to share that just because there's going to be some naysayers out there that are going to say, I've done my research and we've got research proof that birth order does not have an impact. So I just want to make sure that I often use family constellation or psychological position because, for example, let's say the first child in a family might have like autism or severe disability or something. The second person born might kind of assume the role and take on some of the roles and responsibility of being an eldest. Or in certain societies and cultures where there's different expectations for boys and girls, you might have a firstborn male and a firstborn female in terms of their roles, and they will kind of follow out. So just to be, if you're doing birth order and just looking on the date on their birth certificate, it's not going to be enough.
And do you grow out of it, I wonder? Does it always last, or do you grow out of...
Well, everyone's going to go home for the holidays, or they just had Thanksgiving, and you realize, like, man, when I go back home, it doesn't matter if I'm 62, they still treat me like the baby.
Everything reverts,
so I do think that you, in that, in your family dynamic, that gets reassembled. And it can change, for sure. And we're seeing more siblings coming for adult counseling now. So it can change, but it is, I would say, stable across the ages.
I want to ask you about an author who told an amazing story, who was in this studio not that long ago, Alexandra Posadsky, who wrote a book called Rogers versus Rogers.
Yes.
In which the entire, I'm sure it was very titillating for those who were reading about it in media accounts, but for the Rogerses themselves to go through all of that in such a public fashion, I'm sure was incredibly painful for all of them as the siblings fought over Ted Rogers' empire, essentially.
Yeah. Yes.
How, I mean, you're kind of, I guess, in the business of trying to navigate all of that stuff. How do you do it?
Well, I guess you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, if I can put it that way. Once he's broken, I don't know if you can put the pieces. But I think you focus on just of trying to get through the immediate conflict. And then whether or not the family then heals, I imagine there's a lot of hard feelings. My experience is most people will not, reassemble any kind of relationship. Once it's fractured, once there's conflict, you bring in, lawyers. Lawyers automatically raise the temperature. They would have spent a boatload of money. They were fighting about their father's legacy. Everybody thought they knew what the legacy was. Mm-hmm. Everybody says, Dad's on my side, or I'm doing this for Dad.
Would have wanted this.
Yes, would have wanted that, and that empowers. They believe their own narrative. But in that case, though, it was in their, often family squabbles do go to mediation because they don't want the publicity, or to private arbitration to move it out of the public eye. And often you don't even see families fight because they have an estate plan that ensures that goes out.
Well, Steve, it was worse than that in the case of the Rogerses, because not only was it public in as much as the media were covering it as a story, but one of the Rogers siblings was tweeting all about it and taking potshots at Edward, the guy who ended up running the company, who ended up winning is what you would say in the end.
Yeah.
What do you deal with all of that?
I mean, one of the hardest things we all face is judgment. We don't like when someone else is judging us, but it's one thing if it's a personal, quiet thing. When I was bartending, I used to be told, if you're going to cut somebody off, take them to the side, tell them quietly, I'll give you some fake drinks for the rest of the night, I'll give you back your money and everything will be fine, and that would work. But when you take conflict into the public sphere, and when there's judgmental and that sort of stuff, that just raises the whole, you talk about not putting Humpty Dumpty back together. I mean, I think that's what really crashes it, and those are really hard things to get past once they've been said and done.
Okay, let's do something here. This is written by Jeffrey Kluger for Time magazine, one of its cover stories more than a decade ago. And Sheldon, if you would bring this up, I'll read along for those listening on podcast. There's sweetness in the lies parents tell their kids, which is a very good thing since they tell a lot of them. From clan to clan, culture to culture, there's one tall tale nearly all parents tell, and they tell it repeatedly. We do not have a favorite child. Mom and Dad will say it earnestly, they'll repeat it endlessly, and in an overwhelming share of cases, they'll be lying through their teeth. It's one of the worst kept secrets of family life that all parents have a preferred son or daughter, and the rules for acknowledging it are the same everywhere. The favored kids recognize their status and keep quiet about it, the better to preserve the good thing they've got going and to keep their siblings off their back. The unfavored kids howl about it like wounded cats, and on pain of death, the parents deny it all. That's really good. How true is that?
Well, I do think there is truth to it. Mm-hmm. I do think that every parent knows that they should always say, I don't have a favorite. They know that that's psychologically wounding to say it. But there are ways that we express favoritism that even unwittingly parents do not know they are doing it. I deal with that a lot in my...
For example?
Stepping into sibling conflict and taking a side. You hit your brother, you go to timeout. You're older, you should know better. Things like that. Or just having a personality where two people are extroverts and they both like to ski, so they spend all their time on the hills and just have more time to build up the relationship and more things in common. And, when the other one might be, a geek who really likes to play computer games, and they're like, you don't have to say anything. I know you're disappointed in me. You want me to be out on the hill, and I'd rather be on my computer. So you don't have to say a word. I just feel it.
Well, let me pick up on that. Natasha, when one child receives special treatment and everybody knows it, what does that do to the dynamic amongst them?
Yeah, that can have a detrimental effect, to say the least. It can heighten that sibling rivalry, can turn it into something that is a little bit more sinister, like I said.
How about if the parents go to bat for the weakest child?
When you say like going to bat for the weakest child, like as a means of favoritism?
Yeah. When kids fight, invariably the parents will want to make sure that the weaker child or the weakest child is not getting beaten up and damaged all the time, so they go to bat for that kid. What does that do?
It's an interesting, I'm actually living that because mine are 11 and 8, and I do hear feedback from my 11-year-old saying, not in those words, but the message is you're going to bat for the younger one more than me. And I think that there's truth to that. And I think we have to listen. And it's very easy to kind of slip into that pattern, as you say, and not even unwittingly realize what you're doing.
You're trying to level the playing field.
You think you're leveling the playing field. You think there's a rationale for it because that person's younger and because you think that older one should know better, but you're not actually holding space for their experience. And,
In fact, that one that is playing the weaker role quickly learns that I don't have to learn how to solve the conflict and develop those important negotiating skills. Instead, what I'm going to do is when something starts to happen, I'm going to feign being weak, and then I'm going to call in the army called mom and dad, or mom and mom, dad and dad, whatever your family structure is, and that person is going to do my bidding, and they'll probably, get my way for me. So they're less invested in trying to build the relationship with their sibling that they're having conflict with.
Now, based on this, one of the things that's often suggested is sort of date nights with your kids, spending time with a kid, but doing this equally. So it's this idea of being equal, but fair, but not equal. So not doing the exact same thing with every child, finding what they're uniquely interested in. Maybe it's the ski hill, but maybe it is, let me learn your video game world and let me try playing a video game with you and spend some time with you. But also, what I thought was interesting about Natasha is what she tells me that, if a child tells you, hey, I'm feeling unfairness here, ears got to get big at that point. And it's a great opportunity to sit, listen, and let them know that they're heard, let them know that you've thought about it and that you'll carry that with you as you leave.
And that's true too in the estate planning world. I mean, a lot of people don't want to talk to their kids, and so again, time goes by and things fade, or they're under the surface. But a lot of parents won't even talk to their adult children. So if you're going to treat a child differently, which you're entitled to do because you think the child needs a helping hand or is not as successful as you need to talk to your children about that, even adult children, and say, this is why I'm doing it. But people don't want to. Sometimes it's superstitious that I don't want to talk about my death. I don't want to update my estate plan. It's none of your business. But it's their business, because when you die, if you have a chaotic life, a chaotic family life, you're going to have a chaotic estate.
Just so I understand, you say it's imperative to talk to the quote-unquote stronger child about why you are favoring quote-unquote the weaker child in your will?
Yes. Yes.
Talk to the stronger kid.
And also say, often you can have a family meeting and say, this is why I'm doing this. You're the spendthrift child. I'm going to put your money in a trust because I'm worried that you're going to spend it. Now, if you demonstrate to your trustees that you can spend it wisely, you get the money. But I'm giving you less, or I'm giving a boost here because, again, they need the help.
Yeah. How much, let me do one more follow-up with you. How much more complicated does this get in the case of blended families? He starts laughing.
I know. Well, I'm laughing because it's a lot of our bread and butter. You have the first family, as we call it, and then the second spouse. And there, someone's with, particularly if they're with their second spouse a long time, it's usually men, is the reality. But they put money aside for their spouse, but the first family feels the spouse is spending the money or not accountable, and they feel their inheritance is going, the way of the dodo bird. So they fight against the spouse. So it becomes more complicated, and it keeps lawyers very busy.
I shouldn't say this. Well, I'm going to say this. This was a big problem in the Sinatra family, right? The kids and the fourth wife.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And it's typical. It's typical. And we spend a lot of time and paper fighting about that and trying to get past it.
How about gender? How does gender affect rivalry?
I mean, it can affect in a lot of different ways. I know one case, for example, where the oldest child in the family was a boy who played basketball and was quite good at it, and the next child was a girl. And you might expect her to find her own niche or her own whatever, but rather she chose his niche to show that she was just as capable and, in fact, was as capable and was as successful.
At basketball?
At basketball, okay. And was very proud of that fact. So it was kind of like, sometimes the competition, as we talk about, can be positive. And sometimes it can be, oh, yeah, I've enjoyed watching you, watch me now. And I think that was the dynamic in that relationship. And that was, I think, a gender-based thing of kind of showing.
What do you see in that world?
Well, yes, so the same. My parents waited a long time to have a little girl. They had 3 rowdy boys, so finally, and they kept buying me little tea sets and dolls. And I didn't want that. I wanted to do what the boys were doing. I just wanted to be included. I wanted to be one of them. So why did I have the bicycle that had those bars that went like this? I wanted the bar that went across So I didn't want to stand out and be different. I just wanted to belong. But I think it does go back to that apples to oranges comparison. And they probably thought I was preferred, because I stood out as being the different gender.
So that is, because you have 3 older brothers, you obviously would have been treated, and 3 older brothers, and you're the baby,
Yeah.
and you're a different gender.
Perfect.
So in some respects, it's a perfect storm for
Yeah.
sibling rivalry, because you are going to be you're going to have that most favored nation status, aren't you?
And it also means that when you're looking at family dynamics, I would lump the 3 boys together, and I would probably call them a first, a middle, and a baby boy, if I'm looking at how the dynamics kind of play out. And if you have very large families, say 10 kids, you can see where there's sort of clusters, and you have to look at each cluster. So you could have 3 babies in each of those clusters, but again, they're going to orient themselves around their comparables. Do I find that my brother is a threat because we're both boys and we're only 16 months apart, so we both should be able to be getting these marks at school and being on the AAA hockey team, but one's better than the other? That's going to be very different than if it was a sister who's only 16 months and,
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How about-
because differentiation is key.
Yeah.
Right. If the more you can differentiate yourself from a sibling, with the exception of the basketball, I'm actually surprised by that. But the more you can differentiate from a sibling, the better chance of kind of reducing that rivalry. But I would also say there's a cultural element for the gender as well, because in certain cultures, absolutely there will be a favoritism for one gender, particularly boys in South Asian cultures. I grew up in a South Asian family. Baby boy, 2 older sisters. Definitely favored. Youngest boy, different, 2 older sisters, Indian family. So
Favored not just because
not just because he's the baby,
but also because he's a boy.
But because he's a boy, and boys are quite valued in the culture. So, and of course, that can create.
How did the older sisters deal with that?
The older sisters in my family?
Yeah.
I think differently.
Do you read the Riot Act to your parents at some point and say, this cultural
They deny it to
stereotyping
this
has got
day.
to go?
They deny it to this day.
Okay.
But I think at some point you have to accept it and move on. Like that becomes.
But
they'll
again, in
deny
the
it to this
estates
day.
world, it is setting up a recipe for
Yeah.
a will challenge. If one, especially in Western culture where it's, they're supposed to be more egalitarian in some sense, if the boy gets all the money, there's bound to be a challenge. And what's interesting from a gender perspective, it's often the women who are the girls who look after their parents for whatever reason. It's expected. So then is there expectation that I get more, or it's unfair that you're giving it all to a boy, or giving more to a boy, or someone gets the house and I should get the house. So it's interesting. It changes, as I keep saying, from when you're young to when you get older. There's the same dynamics, but life has intervened in some ways and rubbed some edges off and polished others.
You're Dutch background?
Dutch
You?
background, yes.
Is there an ethnic issue here in your family about the way these things are handled?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a little bit before we came on. I mean, my family is not an affectionate family, never was an affectionate family, never was an emotionally expressive family, so to speak. So
They
everything
may be
was
watching
very,
this, Steve.
Yeah, I know. Well, they would know that themselves.
know
My
that,
wife
okay.
family is very much so. I imported some of that after I got married, and it was kind of interesting to try to bring some of that warmth and cuddliness to a family that didn't naturally kind of exude that. But I think things were very driven by the parents, and it was a very authoritative, not authoritarian, like a good authoritative parenting style. So there were rules, there were reasons for the rules. We all kind of had to go by that, and I think they kept us largely in line. Plus, I was so much behind. My sisters were all older. They had done all the real groundbreaking work on my parents. By me, I just kind of slid
Was it
in under the
unhappy
radar.
though? Was it an unhappy childhood then because of that?
No,
just
not
different.
at all, not at all. I mean, my impression of a Dutch style is they want you to become an independent person as young and early as can. I was working when I was 8 years old on a farm doing stuff. We didn't get an allowance. You had to earn your own money if you wanted to buy a bicycle or something like that. And it was just a very preparing you, I think, for adulthood from a very young age. Yeah, and I just thought it was normal. I thought it was fine until I started meeting all these warm people. I was like, oh, that's
Do you have kids, Steve?
I have 2 stepdaughters who now have grandkids. So I have 5 grandkids.
As you see the dynamic play itself out,
Yeah.
do you see the sibling rivalries that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the families is just a boy and a girl. They tend to get along quite well, but the other family has 4 kids, 3 older girls and a boy, just sort of like my situation. And that's where the girls have more of the rivalry that plays out, where they're at roughly the same age and going through stuff. But again, the boy's golden. The little boy is just treated like everybody's little boy. So.
Now, I want wanted to just jump on the comment about the differentiation. Children purposely try to differentiate themselves. So even if you have a family value that you are a musical family, very rarely will you find all kids playing the piano. One will do the piano, the other guitar, the other one drums. You might be a hockey family, but they're not all goalies. One's going to be the left wing one. I don't even know all the positions in hockey.
No, you're doing well.
Bad Canadian. But they will differentiate themselves. Weren't the Stahls brothers? Weren't they the famous hockey? Yeah, they'll differentiate
There's a few
themselves.
Stahl brothers, 6 Sutter brothers who made the NHL.
Yeah, so
But they didn't all
hockey
play the
family,
same position.
Nope. So kids, and then we have to give them opportunity as parents. So as soon as I could start separating my kids were 16 months apart. So when they're young, well, the ballet class, there was only one age group, so I had to put them together. But as soon as I could put them in different classes, in different sports, expose them to different things, different instructors, I worked to give them that individuality so that I was reducing that or increasing the likelihood of differentiating in order to bring down the competitive piece.
Right.
And a lot of it is also how competitive a family is also resides in the marriage. So if the marriage is very competitive, then that seeps down to, you'll have more differentiated, different personalities if the parents are competitive. If the parents are less competitive.
Competitive with each other?
Yes, but not competing like if you lose a board game, you flip the board and have a hissy fit. Like competitive, like everything's judgmental. You have a lot of metrics on things. You keep an eye on judgment. And that gets broadcast to the kids. So they do feel like if somebody is being held in higher regard, that means somebody's falling into disfavor. So when there's abundance in the family, abundance of love, of diversity, of you can do no wrong, unconditional love, the kids don't have to fight so hard to find their own unique niche. They can overlap and not feel like they're being compared.
All you need is love.
That's all you need is love. That's right.
I'm so glad you brought up hockey. Mostly because, not just because I love it and play
I
it.
see you in your sports shirts. I know.
Because we got a clip here. Now, this was a lovely, lovely, if I say so myself, interview with Ken Dryden, the Hall of Fame goaltender of the Montreal Canadiens, who was in this studio several months ago talking about a new book of his. And we talked about his brother, Dave Dryden, who was also a goaltender in the National Hockey League, and his older brother, but not as good as Ken. So there was potential for a very rivalrous, difficult relationship. But it didn't happen. Here's Ken talking about it. Sheldon, if you would.
Dave's 6 years older than me, and he was who I wanted to be. I mean, he could do everything that I wanted to do. I mean, he could catch a puck, when I would go off my wrist or something. He could field a ground ball in a way in which I could. He could throw a curveball, when I couldn't throw a curveball. And so, he just did what I wanted to do.
If you're hearing a bit of a tremor in Ken's voice there, it's because Dave had just died not long before that program, so he was a little fragile there. Dave went on to have a great career. He was a teacher. He was a school principal. But Ken, indisputably, had the better hockey career. I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame. He won 6 Stanley Cups. He got Vezina trophies. He was Team Canada goalie in 1972 in the final game. But the reverence and affection is there. How does that happen?
Again, that's a choice. He clearly looked up to his elder brother, and that's very common. And his older brother obviously didn't take him as the pest or the bother or the somebody that I, have to walk to the store or, that I have to slow down for this little pesty younger sibling. He clearly enjoyed the companionship. And I also think in that generation, parents were more hands-off. You were more free range. You probably went out to the backyard and were out there skating, and there was no parent looking out the window saying, hey, you're being a huck pog. They worked it out. They negotiated it. And so I think that generation was better at having more cohesive sibling relationships because we just get too into it now.
I think in that way it does show the opportunity. We talk about rivalry, and yes, there's some rivalry, but again, it is the opportunity when the kids do work it out themselves on the ring, when they find those skills, when they start to say, okay, there's places we have friction, but there's places where I really admire you. Mm-hmm. That's what you leave the space for, is for that highly personal, deep connection. And those are the connections that really, keep us going through life and beyond, through death. And that's what I saw there in that clip.
Natasha.
And I think the older sibling really does play a role there in terms of determining the dynamic, because the younger sibling will always look up, will always kind of idealize and want to be and mimic and copy the older sibling to some degree. So it's really also a choice. It's not just a choice of the younger sibling to feel that way, but also a choice of the older sibling to embrace that younger sibling and not make them feel, as you said, like a pest. And I think that that's a very, not always an easy choice to make, but a powerful one.
Justin, in our last minute here, given when you see siblings,
Yes.
which is not usually under the most,
Best of circumstances.
the best
No,
of circumstances, yeah, does it kind of question your belief in humanity at all?
Not really. I think people are obviously fundamentally good. Families are complex. I mean, it's interesting. I'm listening to this conversation. It's all when the kids are young. So you put 40 years between when you're a family unit and when you're older. Your parents die. There's grief involved. Life has changed. Some people are more active with parents. Other dementia takes its toll. And so they're not surprisingly, I think there is tension. I don't think it's a bad thing always. I mean, the Rogers family, I mean, that's just tragic. And the lawyer would have told her to stop tweeting for sure, stop creating that kind of mischief in the public realm. But there's a wellspring of goodwill. And generally, they can move past it if you've got a good mediator, decent lawyers. And often if you keep the spouses a little on the side too, because the spouses sometimes, push them saying, your brother always got one over on you. You always got the better deal.
That's not helpful.
So that's not helpful. So sometimes as a mediator, we have to say, it's not your family. And remember what your parents wanted. Your parents want you to get along. Yeah. They don't want you to spend money on lawyers. So figure it out and stop, litigating issues that are decades old.
Great advice. Can I thank Justin DeVries and Alison Schaefer on that side of the table, and Natasha Begagny and Steve Urdens on the other side of the table. Great of all of you to come into TVO tonight and help us out with this, and may your sibling rivalries all be gentle and positive.
Thank you.
In his latest book, author Daniel McFarlane argues that Lake Ontario has been neglected both environmentally and in spirit. The book is called The Lives of Lake Ontario, an Environmental History. He's also an associate professor in the School of Environment, Geography and Sustainability at Western Michigan University, and he joins us now in studio. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we begin our conversation, let's start off with some quick facts about Lake Ontario. It is nearly 19,000 square kilometers in surface area, which makes it the smallest in surface area of the Great Lakes. It is 311 kilometers across, 85 kilometers in width, and as it stands, was established about 11,000 years ago. It is also home to more than 55% of Ontario's population. This lake is huge when we look at those numbers, but not nearly as large as the other Great Lakes. And there are other lakes that are much grander in size that are not Great Lakes, but are bigger, like Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake, Lake Winnipeg, for example. Is Lake Ontario truly as great as the others? Does it stack up?
It is a great lake, all on its own. I mean, by a number of measurements. I mean, I argue in the book it's the most important Great Lake from a political, cultural, economic perspectives, right? As you mentioned, it's majority of the Ontario population is there. Something like a quarter of all Canadians live close to Lake Ontario. So this is, by many measurements, the most important of the Great Lakes. And then, yeah, it's also, pretty great in terms of its beauty. And
help me understand this. You live in America, you live in the States, you are Canadian, but you didn't grow up, you weren't born in Ontario.
Right.
Tell me, how did the fascination of Lake Ontario come about for you?
Right, well, my parents almost had me in Kingston, but then they moved to Saskatchewan before I was born, and then my dad's from Eastern Ontario, so we'd come out in the summers, so coming from a fairly dry province, I was always intrigued as a kid by all the water bodies out in Ontario, Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence, the Rideau and the Trent Canals and that sort of thing. And then when I went to Ottawa for grad school, that's when I first really started studying the history of the waters out here.
All right. Before we get into the history of Lake Ontario, you sent us a couple of photos. Let's have a look here. So this first photo here, these were taken from Chimney Bluffs State Park. This, for our Ontario viewers, is, I would say, directly across from Sandbanks Provincial Park on the other side of Lake Ontario. What are we looking at here? Because this looks quite sharp. but quite fascinating. What are we looking at?
Right, so this is a state park east of Rochester, so it's on the New York side, so Ontario folks may not be as familiar with it, but these are just sand formations that have been there for a long time, and it's protected as a state park. So where the picture is taken from, you can get that close, but you're not supposed to walk onto them actually, because they'd be a little vulnerable to people traipsing all over them.
We have a second photo that, again, shows these fascination. How did this form?
Well, it's a combination of wind and erosion and maybe some glacial past as well that sort of sculpts them in this way.
And how long, I mean, they're looking quite old. How long do we have an idea? And is this somewhere, can we see something like that elsewhere in Lake Ontario? Is that specific to that area?
Those types of formations are very specific to Lake Ontario. In terms of age, perhaps as old as when the last glaciers left, which is some 11,000 years ago.
All right. You talk about glaciers. I want to talk about something that you mentioned in your book, the Little Ice Age. Would you explain how that moment in time affected how Europeans settled here in Lake Ontario?
Right, so we're familiar with climate change today in terms of the climate getting warmer, but climate change has happened, of course, in the past that human society has had to adjust to. So the Little Ice Age is a period roughly from the 1400s into the mid-19th century where the climate gets a little bit cooler. And so I argue that was sort of a turnoff for European settlers to a certain extent, right? So that colder climate, it's good for thicker furs for the fur trade and things like that, but it requires adjusting. So perhaps that helped stave off sort of the settler invasion of indigenous lands for a long time. But then when that ice age is starting to thaw into the 19th century and things are getting warmer, that sort of goes hand in glove with European expansion.
Now, there were settlements there at that time as well.
Right, so there's already been, well before the Little Ice Age is over, we have some of the first settlements at, York and what's before York, which becomes Toronto, as well as at the Kingston end of the lake, where the Niagara River goes into the lake as well. So there's forts, European forts. And of course, there's many indigenous communities that predated all of that.
Well, let's talk about that. You also mentioned that what happened when Europeans met indigenous peoples and the effect they had on the population. How in turn has that affected the environment around the lake? Because that was something that you talk about in your book when we talk about the forests and sort of the agriculture there. When shifts happen, the lake gets impacted as well. So how does that look?
Right, so indigenous uses of the lake or of the area around it certainly predate Europeans. They were, they had agriculture, would cut down some forests, but their impact is fairly benign or done in a sustainable way. When Europeans start arriving, well, first, diseases often move ahead of the Europeans, so decimating some estimates of, maybe 90% of indigenous peoples may have been exposed to death from diseases like that. So that clears the land to some extent, helping foster the misconception that this is land open for taking.
Right.
And so when Europeans are coming along, at certain points they do encounter a lake shore that isn't that populated. That's also has to do with, especially on the south side of the lake, with the Haudenosaunee groups that live there, often didn't keep their permanent camps right at the lake.
Right.
The kid would come there seasonally. So there was a bit of a misconception that this was land free for the taking, and of course that's sustained by European ideologies as well.
I think for most Canadians and people who live in Ontario, the lakes almost serve as have a functional purpose. I think we forget how far our history goes with this lake. How politically, I think that's an interesting one. How important is this lake when it comes to being Ontarian or Canadian?
Right, well, I suggest in the book, Canada might not be a country if it wasn't for Lake Ontario. So when you take the St. Lawrence River together with Lake Ontario, that forms the heartland of Canada from a historic perspective, right? Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, all the historical capitals of Canada that preceded Ottawa, where a lot of the first French and English settlers. And then that waterway provides a lifeline back to Britain as well, and then is a bridge and also a barrier between the U.S. So in many ways, Lake Ontario helps Canada become a separate country from the United States.
How about current day, present day?
Well, this is the North Shore of Lake Ontario is the most important part of Canada from a population, financial, industrial perspective. So it's still, in many ways, the heartland of Canada and the center from a population perspective.
All right, we have a couple of paintings that I want to show. Now, these paintings, the first one, are of locals who are hanging out at the waterfront. This is a painting of the steamship Chief Justice Robinson Landing, and passengers are actually getting off the ice. This is in 1852. And you can also see sort of in the foreground there, ice boats and horse-drawn sleighs on ice. I want to pull up another photo here. This is what many people would be familiar with, the Toronto Island. This is, you can see people out skating, having a good time there. What was the relationship like between early settlers and the lake?
Right, so both these paintings are of Toronto Harbor. So a lot of what that is showing is, well, it's before it gets too polluted in a way we might not recognize today, but communities face the lake. Right, they were centered on the lake. That was also the main means of transportation, so obviously by ships. But even in winter, in some ways winter, and this is where having the little ice age actually could help in some ways.
Right.
Now it becomes easier to travel by ice, so you see ice boating going on there, sleds, skating, all those different things, as well as ice cutting for, you know, underground refrigeration in the summertime. So the communities like what would become Toronto are focused on the lake, whereas they turn their back on the lake in more contemporary periods.
Well, let's talk about that. You know, I think people in Toronto kind of forget about the lake. You talk about that a little bit, you know, when we think about cottage season, you know, people aren't hanging out in Lake Ontario, for example. I was driving up Lake Superior, and every stop you can kind of pull up and have, you know, you can camp right on Lake Superior. But in Ontario, in Lake Ontario, we'd rather drive up to, you know, the Muskokas or Georgian Bay and hang out there. We kind of ignore it. What do you think that says about how the lake is used in the provincial capital now? Right.
Well, Lake Ontario, compared to the other Great Lakes, was in many ways turned into a working lake that we use for industrial purposes, that we put our pollution into. So in the minds of a lot of people, that's the lake that you use for those purposes, and then you leave Lake Ontario to go to a different Great Lake or to the Muskokas for your vacation. So it's partly reflecting the fact, yes, it arguably is the most degraded Great Lake because of what we've done to it, but at the same time, it's a perception of it's not a wilderness lake in the same way Lake Superior is or those other lakes.
There are probably people who are going to be watching this who are proud Lake Ontarian supporters and are probably sad to hear, you know, that. What kind of impact does, you know, it being a functional lake, a working lake, have on how it's being used?
Well, I think it led to the way Toronto organized its infrastructure, for example. It actually turned its back, both literally and metaphorically, I think, on Lake Ontario in terms of building what's built at the waterfront, railways and then freeways and that sort of thing, actually blocking people from the lake, although we have seen people turning back towards the lake in recent times, and, you know, the greening of more of the lakefront as well.
Before we talk about the ecological impact, let's have a look at the expanse of Lake Ontario and its surrounding area. Here's Lake Ontario, and you should be able to see the major Canadian cities from the U.S. border moving along the shore up then toward the east. And so that's Niagara Falls, St. Catharines, Hamilton, Toronto, and towards Kingston. Now, here's the drainage basin, the area that feeds or empties into Lake Ontario, including Niagara Falls and the river that is at the tail end of Lake Erie and downstream in the Great Lakes system, the Trent-Severn Waterway, and rivers and streams coming from the area. And then here are the areas of concern, or the AOCs in Canada, that hover around the major cities along the lake. All right. What about Lake Ontario's geographic position is concerning for you in terms of what's happening to the lake environmentally?
Well, there's a few factors. One, it's downstream of the other Great Lakes, so a lot of that pollution gets passed along. It's also, of course, directly downstream from the Niagara River, which is a very heavily used industrial and electrochemical center. So a lot of bad pollution is coming in from that river. And then, of course, we've already talked about the heavy population and industrial uses in the GTA and around the lake. So all of that is just, you know, pouring toxics and pollutions into Lake Ontario.
One of the things that when we think about the Great Lakes, for a very long time, Lake Erie was kind of considered a dead lake. You know, we'd talk about sort of fires happening on the lakes themselves. How did Lake Ontario keep living, even as you mentioned geographically, we're downstream, we're the last ones, keep living, so to speak, because it's at the tail end of it?
Right. So in the 1960s, Lake Erie was often being declared dead because of pollution and eutrophication, which is the overgrowth of algae, which then befouls the water, uses up oxygen. A lot of the same thing was going on in Lake Ontario in this period, but because Lake Erie is shallower, it shows the effects more, so it was more noticeable. But that led to, pollution led to the first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which only applied to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, as well as the St. Lawrence.
How toxic did it get?
Well, that stage toxics, when we're talking 1960s, 1970s, aren't
Standards
the big
are different.
worry yet. We're not using as many of them, although we certainly were a lot then. Nowadays, toxics are the bigger worry. At that, in the 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement didn't apply to toxics, but the 1978 agreement, which came obviously a few years later, did.
All right. Well, you mentioned a very important day when we talk about Great Lakes. April 1972, Richard Nixon, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Talk to me a little bit the significance here for Ontario. You talked about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement.
Right. So what we have is the President and the Prime Minister signing this agreement, which is the culmination of, in many ways, decades of negotiations between the U.S. and Canada to try to come up with some agreement to address pollution within the Great Lakes. And in the 1972 agreement, it's the lower lakes, so Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So that's working through what's called the International Joint Commission, which oversees bilateral water bodies. So this is an agreement to try to limit, especially things like phosphorus and nitrogen. Right? This is the baby boom period. People have all these new wonder machines.
Right.
They're using detergents in their dishwashers and their washing machines. That's causing problems in the lake. That causes that eutrophication that I mentioned earlier. So this first water quality agreement is very much about doing that. And it is fairly successful in cleaning up Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, at least visually in terms of a lot of algae. Part of that is because both countries spend a lot on building water treatment plants.
Right.
As well.
I am curious, we celebrated 50 years only 2 years ago. Looking back now, how important was that agreement to the lifeline of Lake Ontario?
It's quite an agreement in that it's very much a groundbreaking international environmental agreement that has been seen as a model, I think, globally. So it probably kept things from getting a lot worse. We still never really lived up to it, but that's largely because both nations haven't kept up that funding past the 1970s or actually tried to bring industry to heel a little bit to stop the worst of that pollution.
Do you think we've done a good job on that? I want to push back a little bit on that.
No, I don't think we've done a good job. That 72 agreement was very important. 78 agreement as well. I mean, that's one of the first applications of the ecosystem principle, comes out of that agreement, but we absolutely have not lived up to it. And that's mostly Ontario as well as the New York State and the governments of Canada and the U.S. not putting the money in to actually do what we need to be doing. So
What do we need to be doing?
Well, we've got the architecture in place to do what we need to do with those agreements, but I mean, there's a lot of direct and indirect things we need to be doing. So the amount of plastics and toxics that we're putting into the lake now are, overwhelming and egregious, but we refuse to, put sufficient limits on anything industrial that would hinder economic growth in any way. So a lot of it's wider societal things about not prioritizing environmental health.
I don't want you to point fingers here, but is there industries that we should be looking at that should have some stricter rules put in place when we're looking at possible solutions here?
Yeah, certainly anything to do with fossil fuels, plastics, and then in the Niagara region, a lot of the chemical companies and things like that. But it's also, the cumulative impact. A lot of it comes from agriculture and fertilizer and runoff. It's much easier to deal with point source pollution, which was what that first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement did, but non-point source is much harder to deal with, and so we're not doing effective jobs of policing that.
I am curious, in terms of, you mentioned policing, how does one enforce something like this when we have this vast body of water that is shared between two nations? We do have bodies that are there, but how hard is it to kind of enforce these rules?
Well, it's very difficult. We actually do have some decent regulations, so a lot of the time it's not actually enforcing them is the problem. But beyond that, we certainly have stronger regulations. I mean, if we look at what is being done to human health as well as ecosystem health, even if you want to measure it by economic impacts instead of just health impacts, often those impacts are more negative than the benefits that come from economic activity, but because we prioritize industrial and economic uses and, sort of the magic formula of economic growth and GDP above all else, that comes before ecological and human health.
I feel like if we're to grade all of the Great Lakes, you probably are going to grade Lake Ontario right at the bottom there. I'm just curious, how is the lake now? What are some of the issues that you think should be brought to focus? Because I know in your book you talk a lot about microplastics as well and some other issues, but what is kind of the main concerns for you?
Yeah, we have improved in terms of some of the conventional pollutants. There's less of some heavy metals such as mercury. things like that have been, or DDT, some of those things, were outlawed. You still see legacy contaminants in the sediments. But now we have a lot of new things. So a lot of researchers in the last 10, 20 years have been uncovering just how big of an impact plastics are in terms of not only being in sediments, but they get inside living things and then bioaccumulate to move their way up. Plastic is often toxic as well. PFAS is sort of that new forever chemical that's come onto our radar screens only in the last decade or so because it lasts so long and can bioaccumulate as well. So those are sort of some of the tip of the iceberg, or really outstanding or really apparent types of pollutants that we're now dealing with.
I do have to ask, just talking with some of our colleagues, just how we have a little bit of a battle here when it comes to which is our favorite lakes. We have a few people who love Lake Superior, some who are diehard Lake Ontarians, but I don't hear a lot of people going into Lake Ontario. I love going into Lake Ontario. If I can, I will. I'm in at Cobourg Beach. It's one of my favorite places to go. When's the last time you dip your toes into Lake Ontario? Is this something that you encourage and do?
I absolutely encourage. Last year, or actually this past summer was the last time I was in Lake Ontario. Down near Niagara on the lake, as well as at Sandbanks. So we tried to, as I was writing this book, we tried to explore a lot of the different parts of Lake Ontario. And you're right that a lot of people sort of turn their noses historically at going into Lake Ontario, but there's always been a diehard community that would do that. And I think during the pandemic that really increased a lot too. So now you see people using the Toronto Islands a lot more, and there's a push to make that more available to the public and create more beaches.
We have about a minute left, and I have to ask this question because you now live on the other side of the border. So, with Trump as president-elect, he has openly stated that the administration is going to tap Canada's water. Should Ontarians and Canadians be worried about the future of Lake Ontario? I don't know how feasible that statement is, but should we be worried about one of our Great Lakes?
Yeah, well, we need to be worried about everything environmental with the Trump presidency. There is something called the 2008 Great Lakes Compact, which theoretically put some legal limits on other states from the U.S. being able to divert water. But Trump's, of course, a wild card on a lot of these issues. So I don't know how feasible it would within the next 4 years for him to do that, but it's certainly something to stay worried about and stay vigilant about.
Fair enough. Daniel, I want to thank you so much for coming into studio. Really great book and really great dive into the history of Lake Ontario. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the agenda for Monday, December 9th, 2024. Tomorrow, a feature interview with Ontario's Auditor General, Shelley Spence, to discuss her scathing report on how the PC government dealt with Toronto's waterfront. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.